The elections on December 4th in Russia are for the Duma, which is the lower house of the parliament. This is now the only popularly elected house because Putin changed the upper house to be appointed by the president. Um, it will be important, I think, in a symbolic sense. The United Russia Party in the last elections in 2007 won over 60% of the vote, and the turnout was over 60% as well. That's important as a sort of broad legitimator of not only the ruling party, which Putin and Medvedev both in some sense lead, even though technically Putin hadn't been a member of it even when he was heading the parliamentary list, somewhat ironic, kind of father of the nation gets to do that. It's important, I think, not only for legitimating the party, but also legitimating the Putinist system as a whole. So Putinism, I think, benefits from having people come out and vote and sort of put their stamp of approval on the system as it is. Now, if the turnout ends up being dramatically lower than what it was last time, certainly if it ends up being lower than 50%, or if the vote for United Russia, I think it's very unlikely that the vote for United Russia would be lower than 50%. I think at the end of the day that won't be permitted, but if it is lower, then I think that will send a message that people are broadly dissatisfied with the system, they're dissatisfied with Putin. On the other hand, if it is higher, if it is legitimately higher, or if it's the same as what it was, then I think that will send a different message that, people are satisfied with the recovery from the crisis, the basic stability of the system, the basic, rights and freedoms that they have today, which are better than what they had 20 years ago under the Soviet system, although not obviously perfect. This election will be very much like American elections of the recent past, that it's about the economy, stupid. This is going to be a case where Russians will go to the polls thinking about, how is their bottom line doing? How's their bank account doing? Do they have a job? Has their salary been reduced and has it stayed down? That happened to a lot of Russians, including some members of the emerging middle class in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and that's very significant. Particularly in the Russian regions, when you get outside the major cities, people are still hurting since the crisis. Some people have just not caught up altogether. They've been left behind since the 1990s and the collapse of the Soviet system. Their jobs never came back, and they're still waiting for prosperity. So a lot of people will be dissatisfied, but then I think there are others who are basically fine with the system as it is. They're enjoying kind of the trickle down of the natural resource wealth that Russia has and that it sells on international markets. The bottom line is people will go out to the polls and they will vote in a way that reflects their feelings about their basic levels of prosperity and welfare right now. They are not going to be voting, on some kind of referendum about Russian democracy, by and large. A handful of people will lodge a protest vote, perhaps by voting for another party or voting against all. That's an option that exists in the Russian electoral system, in all post-Soviet electoral systems. And a lot of people won't vote as a result of that. But this is not fundamentally about the political system as much as it is about the welfare of the Russian people. This is actually the first time since 2004 that Russia has allowed OSCE, that's Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, monitors into the country to monitor an election. That organization is essentially Euro-Atlantic wide, which means it includes North America, Western Europe, the former communist states of Eastern Europe, and of course Russia and the former Soviet states. So this is a pretty broad and inclusive group. It is viewed as widely legitimate. Generally, when they say an election is free and fair, it is. When they say it's not, it's not. This is not an organization that's really in the pocket of anyone. Obviously, the Russians have objected to it in the past because they can't tell it what its conclusions should be. I think the big problem, though, with and any kind of observer delegation for these Russian elections, but particularly with the OSCE, is that they haven't been there all along. You can read the headlines. It's a relatively free media space, at least on the internet. You can tell what's been going on. For example, the Russian government has not allowed some liberal parties, including notably Parnas, the Party of People's Freedom, which is headed by a number of former very senior officials from the 1990s. They haven't allowed these guys to participate in the elections. So if you're observing the elections, you'd like to look back over the last year or several years and see the conditions that have shaped the competition that's going to be kind of culminating in the December 4th Duma election. And that's obviously hard for an election observation mission to do, even when you have long-term observers, because that's really only a month and a half or 2 months. So this is about the system as a whole, and you kind of need you need almost a system-wide observer mission to judge it appropriately. Irrespective of whether Putin himself appears on the party list for United Russia, he is the flag bearer of the ruling party. He has long been viewed as the sole figure who shapes the agenda for the party, even though Medvedev will now formally be heading that list, is likely to be made prime minister after Putin wins the election in March and then becomes president in May. Putin really is the person who defines the agenda for the ruling party, both on the legislative side and on the executive side. That separation of powers is rather informal in the Russian context. So I think, in a sense, a vote for the United Russia Party is an endorsement of Putin's agenda as it's understood by the people. That doesn't mean, though, that people will feel the sense of obligation that they would feel personally towards Putin coming out on December 4th, or that they would even come out. And so I think typically the polls have reflected that the United Russia Party trails Putin by something like 20 or 30%. And that could be reflected in the election as well. Obviously, if Putin is at 70% popularity, subtract 30% from that, and you're at 40%. That's about where United Russia is polling right now, somewhere in the mid-40s. If that's the result of the election, then that does send a negative signal, and I think it is a two-way street. If Putin is the guy who represents United Russia's agenda, then I think he also is hurt by a bad showing for United Russia. It's more likely than not that the United Russia Party, which is Putin and Medvedev's ruling party, is going to win more than 50%. In the past, it's won above 60%. Its popularity right now is below 50%, but I think there's going to be a lot of acrobatics between now and Election Day. There already has been some. There may be some tampering with the vote. That's always possible. It probably won't happen procedurally during the voting, but it would have something to do with the way the results are tabulated. And then, of course, there'll be regional variation. So, for example, it's more important that United Russia do very well in the major cities than it is in regions which are largely irrelevant to what goes on in Moscow or St. Petersburg. So I think you're going to see a victory for United Russia. It might be a slimmer margin, and that will be interpreted as something of a complaint or a protest against the system as it is, but that won't necessarily tar Vladimir Putin himself. That's about, general disaffection. We still like the leader. We still like the father of the nation. I don't expect this to be a major signal of how he would do in March of next year when he runs for what will be his third term as president. Other than certain extreme stripes of opposition, you have obviously extreme nationalism, you have the Communist Party, and they're always going to win a few percentage points just from their kind of de facto constituents. But if you could describe a broader liberal opposition, they're looking for reform. I think first and foremost, they're looking to see Putin and Medvedev follow through on their longtime promises, which are consistent with the notion of a dictatorship of laws, and that's rooting out corruption and making sure that the system really works according to law. The problem with their delivering on those promises, of course, is it's very hard to eliminate corruption at a micro level in people's day-to-day lives when officials look up at the system, they look all the way up to the Kremlin, and they see that corruption is tolerated at very high levels, and indeed in some cases it's depended upon to actually grease the wheels and make the system work. So I think they will have a lot of trouble with the corruption issue. Another major interest of the liberal opposition is economic modernization. But this is also a theme that Putin and Medvedev have picked up, I think trying to capture some of the center and trying to capture some of this liberal sentiment in the electorate. But they're going to have a lot of trouble with economic modernization as well. It's a country that, other than its extractive industries, which make a lot of money but depend very heavily, of course, on where the global economy is going for prices of commodities, has not been significantly reformed since the end of the Soviet era. A lot of the basic industries still look very much like they did in the 1970s and 80s, and that means they're not competitive. Putin and Medvedev have begun to change that. There are a few bright spots. The problem, I think, is going to be how do you take something like the Skolkovo initiative, which is the goal of creating a Silicon Valley outside of Moscow, and make that more than an experiment in a petri dish, without changing the basic infrastructure of the society, both psychologically and physically. It's going to be very hard to produce that on a broader scale. The younger generation of Russians right now is still an emerging story. There are some clear indicators. I think on the one hand, you have some members of what you could call the first fully post-Soviet generation who have nonetheless signed up for an awfully Soviet-like nomenclatura system. That is, they'd like to become bureaucrats, they'd like to become managers or executives in state-linked energy or other major companies. They would like to benefit from the system of power and wealth as it exists, and I think those people are dependents of the system, therefore. They will be supportive of the system, where you sit is where you stand. I think there's another trend among youth, and those are the people who, if you think about growing up in the 1990s in Russia, things were chaotic, very difficult to get by. A lot of young people had to support, older relatives. They had to deal with major changes in life, including declining demographics, where essentially the older generation was dying. And young people had to step up to the plate. So you have a very entrepreneurial, very energetic generation that was kind of shaped in this crucible of the 1990s. I don't think these people have a tremendous amount of patience for the stagnation that appears to be gripping the political life of the country, and certainly what you could call kind of the big state oligarchic business of the country. They don't benefit a tremendous amount from that. That said, I don't think that they're at the tipping point today where they're ready to pour out into the streets. But they're voting with their feet gradually. They're squirreling their money away in the West. They spend as much time as they can out of the country. They travel tremendously because they have the freedom to travel. So that's kind of the dichotomy that's emerging among the youth today. But I also would say that it's an as yet unwritten story, because obviously these people have a long future ahead. But more than that, they look out ahead, and the government does as well, and they see sort of an unsolvable problem, which is that you've got an inverse pyramid demographically. You're going to have a lot more people moving into retirement and pension age, people needing pretty significant medical care given the condition of the healthcare system, and these things are all very expensive. At the same time that that's happening, it's likely that revenues from energy and other natural resource extraction is going to plateau. At a very minimum, we know that it's going to be unpredictable. Energy prices are always unpredictable, and that means that the state budget at various points may not be able to sustain the expenses that it's going to incur. Well, whose shoulders is that burden going to fall on? Right? Unless the international community comes to Russia's rescue with trillions of dollars, which is pretty unlikely, the young generation is going to be taxed to pay those debts. And I think that's where kind of the rubber meets the road of the disaffection of this 1990s generation that's going to say, wait a second, we've worked really hard, we've innovated, we've tried to grow this economy, even in the face of a relatively stagnant system, and now you want to take it all away from us. They're probably not going to accept that. Some of the themes that are likely to emerge very strongly, and that have emerged already in the campaign around the Duma election, will grow stronger in the approach to March. One of Vladimir Putin's goals is typically to kind of nip dissent and nip problems in the bud. That's not to say that he uses force to crush every problem. Sometimes he actually, buys off his critics. Sometimes he creates a distraction. Sometimes he actually solves the problem. So I think he's going to be looking to respond to those things, the things that he detects between December and March, so that he can get a better result. I would bear in mind, though, that the way that Russian voters tend to look at an individual, particularly an individual who's viewed with such, great regard and respect and, broadly speaking, appreciation for what he's done for the country as Vladimir Putin, is very different from the way that they look at institutions and a system as a whole. So when they're voting for a party list, like the United Russia party list in the December Duma elections, there's a kind of anonymity to doing that maybe enables people to protest a little bit more with their vote. There's less of a sense of personal obligation to go out and vote in the first place, whereas, if you graft Putin onto the wider sweep of Russian history and you compare him to past Russian, Soviet, and Imperial Russian leaders, I think there is a real sense of identification among many Russians that, this is our leader, this is the father figure. When the state asks us to go out and vote for him, which the state will do for him, we will go out and vote. I think that message has been sent and received.